Thy will be done. Teaching the Talmidi Israelite faith through the words of the Our Father by Shmuel ben Naftali. Please visit our website at www.talmidi.co.il. Continuing Chapter 2, the Ancient Community of the Way and the Talmidi Israelite View of the Second Temple Period. Section 16. Jacob the Pious, the real first leader of the Community of the Way. After Yeshua's death, his cousin Jacob the Pious became leader of the Jewish community of Yeshua's followers. This means that even Simon Peter was subordinate to him. Jacob guided the community from the years 32 to 62 CE of the first century. He was greatly admired by many in the wider Jewish community as being a just and a pious man. He is better known to Christians as St. James the Just, the author of the Letter of James, the 20th book of the New Testament. Within our community, Jacob the Pious and Yeshua, or Jesus of Nazareth, are both admired and respected as holy men of God, Jacob as a tzaddik, a pious one, and Yeshua as a prophet. Let me quickly explain what a tzaddik is in Jewish terms. There are two terms used to describe what a modern Westerner would understand as saintly individuals: a tzaddik, a pious one, and a chassid, a devoted one. The difference in Judaism is that we don't pray to them or expect miracles from them, and we definitely don't ask them to intercede on our behalf in order to obtain favors from God. They are mortal men and women who live lives of piety, humility, and simple devotion to God. In the manner of their lives, it becomes evident to those around them that God is supremely present with them, and their souls overflow with the sanctity of God's presence. In Talmidaism, instead of praying to these holy men and women, we study their lives and try to learn from them or even emulate them. Both Chassidim and Tzaddikim are, in a sense, Jewish saints, or more properly, holy people. The difference between Chassidim and Tzaddikim is that, according to ancient Jewish belief, a tzaddik is also able to gain forgiveness for the sins of others through the elevated quality of their prayer. This is a really important point to take in. In Hasidic Judaism, they say that tzaddikim are not aware of who they are while they live or what they are capable of doing. Considering that Jacob was only crowned a pious one, a tzaddik, after he died, he most likely was unaware of his status in God's sight while he lived. When comparing Jacob and Yeshua, the odd thing is, Yeshua's ministry lasted for only about 3 years, and yet the world has an almost infinite amount of literature on him. In total contrast, Jacob's ministry lasted an incredible 32 or 34 years, and yet there is hardly anything written about him, even given that we have more proof of his existence than we do of Yeshua. In mainstream Christianity, St. James is little more than a minor saint, and within the Catholic Church especially, there is an almost deliberate, intentional confusion over who St. James was. From what our community has found out, we have come to the conclusion that this sorry state of affairs is down to 2 things. First, that Jacob was the real leader of the Jewish community of Yeshua's followers, and that Shimon Kephar, the apostle Simon Peter, was in fact subordinate to him. This fact alone is an uncomfortable one for those who believe that Jesus put Peter at the head of the church. The second is the more stunning fact and potentially the more subversive. Now, as I have already mentioned, there is a Jewish folk belief that, for the sake of the pious ones, the world is not destroyed. It was the belief of the Jewish community of Yeshua's followers that through Jacob's ministry of prayer on behalf of the Jewish people, Jerusalem was spared destruction for as long as he was alive to continue his ministry of prayer. Jacob's ministry was viewed by Jewish followers of the time as one of prayerful intercession for forgiveness on behalf of the sins of the people. Because Jacob was such a pious and holy man, his prayers were able to gain forgiveness for the sins of the many. And this is the extraordinary thing to take note of. He didn't have to suffer, or die, or shed any blood. His prayer alone as a man of piety gained forgiveness for the nation. In terms of theology, this early Talmidi belief about Jacob is an earthquake. No one had to suffer and die, no blood had to be shed, and no animal sacrifices were necessary to effect forgiveness of sin. Instead, he prayed constantly in the temple every day for most of his life, and God heard him, and the misery of exile was held back. The nation was saved from the tribulation by Jacob's prayer. Shortly after Jacob's death, however, the situation in Galilee and Judea went from bad to worse. Within 4 years there was war, and 8 years after his death the temple was destroyed. These two things, that Jacob was the head of the community and not Peter, and that Jacob's ministry of prayer gained the forgiveness of sins, are uncomfortable facts for adherents of Paulist theology, who believe that only the death of Christ can achieve this. It is better, therefore, for the mainstream that Jacob's existence remain a blur. Another interesting little point that has come up in our research, there is a possibility that the reason why we have so little about Jacob is that the details of his life, his deeds and his words, were hijacked and used to write the backgrounds of other historical and quasi-historical characters. The best case in point is the martyrdom of Stephen in the New Testament book of Acts. There is an ancient Ebionite work called the Ascent of James, which is now found within a larger work called the Clementine Recognitions. After we remove the few Christian additions to the work, we realize how strikingly similar Paul's assault on James is to the story of the martyrdom of Stephen. Now, the name Stephen means crown in Greek. One of Jacob's titles was the Crown and Prince of the Congregation. We have no doubt that the story of Paul's attack on Jacob in the Ascent of James and in other historical works, and the story of the martyrdom of Stephen in Acts, are actually one and the same story. The only difference in the Ascent of James is that Jacob was not killed when Paul physically assaulted him. He was merely left for dead. The second example is that Jacob, when he was being stoned to death in 62 CE, he was famously credited as saying, "I beseech you, Lord and Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that was a quote from Hegesippus, a Christian writer of the 2nd century CE. The tale is also told that people would vie to touch the hem of his clothing in the hope of being blessed by some of the holiness God had endowed Jacob with. He was also dedicated as a Nazirite from the time of his mother's womb. It is therefore possible, like the prophet Samuel, who was also a Nazirite from the time of his mother's womb, that he was brought up from early childhood as an attendant in the temple, and so spent most of his life there in service and prayer. Even knowing that Jerusalem and the temple were going to be destroyed, he decided to stay in Jerusalem, praying for the sins of the people, serving the poor, and encouraging the people to endure and resist violence. From what little we have gleaned in the scant sources, and from the opinions of Jacob himself voiced in the Ascent of James in the Clementine Recognitions, it is possible a lot of what Jacob the Pious was actually got overlaid onto Yeshua. For example, the traditional image of Yeshua as having a long beard and long hair was probably actually Jacob, since he was a lifelong Nazirite. Yeshua could not have been a lifelong Nazirite, since he drank wine, which is something forbidden to a Nazirite during the time of their vow. The only Jewish men in that time period to have had long uncut hair and a long beard were Nazirites. This brings up some tantalizing questions. Could it be that in the attempt to wipe out the memory of a man whose ministry is so theologically dangerous to Paulist belief, that Paul's early Gentile believers took apart Jacob's words and put them into Yeshua's mouth? Is it possible that some of Yeshua's deeds in the New Testament were actually the deeds of Jacob the Pious? Did the sacred reputation of Jacob become the reputation of Yeshua instead? Sadly, these are questions which will never be answered with any degree of certainty. We are left instead with the words of Robert Eisenman. In his book, James, the Brother of Jesus, he wrote, "Whatever James was, Jesus was also." The new, updated image we get of Yeshua is one of an ordinary rustic Jewish man, a true man of the people, who was able to put the Jewish religion into terms that the ordinary man and woman in the street could relate to, someone who was charismatic and inspired people. He was a true prophet, plucked from his rural country life, called by God to speak as a prophet, and placed on a path which would eventually lead to his death. Then we have Jacob the Pious. He was a very religious, learned man, pious and faithful to Torah in all his ways, who attended temple every day. He was considered extremely wise, and was approached often by both the learned and the simple for his opinions. He was a true tzaddik, whose ministry was one of constant intercession to God for the city and people of Jerusalem. Furthermore, the picture that forms in our minds of Jacob is of an intensely holy and prayerful man, a man of justice and selfless kindness. He seems to have been a man so filled with God's love that, despite his humble demeanour, he was able to disarm others with his words. He was loved and respected by the people of all Jewish religious parties of the time, even the Pharisees, who actually tried to defend him against the high priest, who eventually had him sentenced to death. And when that failed, it was their protests that got the high priest deposed for carrying out a sentence which was normally reserved for the Roman governor to pronounce and carry out. Jacob and Yeshua were two different people. Their ministries were different but complementary. Jacob carried on where Yeshua left off. We, as followers of the Way, are incredibly privileged to have had such a wonderful, saintly man of simple piety as Jacob in our faith's history. On the whole, mainstream Christianity does not want him. It would rather he remain obscure. Actually, we're glad they don't want him. He was ours, and his life is ours today to inspire us towards the same humble and compassionate service of God. Please see the links to the next video and my previous videos in the description below. If you have any genuine interests in Talmidaism, you can join our discussion group by sending a blank email with "subscribe" in the title to talmidi-subscribe@yahoogroups.com. If you have a genuine inquiry and want to know more about Talmidaism, please email thywillbedone.talmidi@gmail.com.